Hi everyone, and thanks for having me for the talk today. And I hope you do get a chance to go out to Strathmore and see the work there. So I'm an artist. I'm based in Tweed Heads on the east coast of Australia, but my formative years were studying in Brisbane, and I lived in Brisbane for a long time, and that's where my career as an artist started. I majored in sculpture and minored in new media, which was pretty basic in those days, the idea of new media. But, and that was at Griffith University in Queensland. But what I recognised from an early stage is I started to experiment with the use of projected image and sculpture works that I was creating, or paintings, surfaces I was creating. I started to explore with this idea of crossing over those mediums and utilising projection. And I guess that sort of led me on a path of working in spaces and unconventional spaces and public spaces, because I recognised that the fusion of the projected image and the spaces I was projecting onto created their own narrative. You know, you couldn't ignore the places that you were creating these works because the projection was actually highlighting them. And that became a really exciting possibility for me. I was really influenced by some of the New York artists like Walter de Maria, Gordon Matta Clark, the idea of disrupting the spaces we know as an intervention and finding new ways, or leading the audience into new ways of interpreting them. And so that was really an exciting revelation. And that, along with projection, I mean, this is nearly 30 years ago, no one was taking projectors outdoors to even experiment with this. So it was a new medium to be used in that way. It was being used a lot in galleries at that point and earlier. But there was I saw this great opportunity for something new, I guess, and new sculpture and installation. That's what I was interested in. So once I started experimenting externally, I was doing works in car parks and whatever I could find, or wherever I could get a projector. I started to really recognise the importance or the engagement of audiences in public space. I had a gallery, and I have had a gallery practice for a long time, especially in institutions, but primarily I was really interested in public space. And I really liked that opportunity where you capture an audience free of the baggage of art and art experience and art history, and there's this immediate experience. So that was really compelling for me. I thought today I'd just sort of talk about some projects. I've got many strains of work because, working with specific sites, I've found that I apply different applications based on the site and the concepts that I'm developing for that site, and that sometimes is photographic, sculptural. But I'm going to focus on projection works and works that sort of relate to the Monuments Project, which is the current touring projects here in the US. So I'll just go through, I'll show you some. So I developed the tree projection project, the idea of projecting portraits onto trees, almost in my last year of university. It happened by chance. I was invited to go to a festival, the Woodford Folk Festival, which is a large festival in Australia in Woodlands. And I had been experimenting with sort of black and white Richard Avedon photos projected onto my sculptures and my paintings, etc., in the studio. And I decided to take it out to this bushland. I had a truck with a generator and a 35mm slide projector with this 35mm high contrast slide. And we just drove around the site as a form of experimentation. Initially, I thought I was going to have to build something in the forest, to accommodate the projection, etc. So I was just experimenting, and to be honest, it wasn't that satisfying. This sort of movement of this portrait wasn't really doing much, but it just happened to scan across a tree that was exactly the same size as the projected portrait. And it instantly popped as a three-dimensional object. And that sort of led to this strain of practice, really, because then it started, the question started to arise, what does it mean to position the human form on nature and on these natural environments? So there's a whole lot of things started to play out just with that one experimentation. And it has developed over the years. I have a practice which is very site-specific, where I work for months and months on a specific project. This project has enabled me to build a project that is site-specific, but is also changeable in every location. It incorporates the local community, it incorporates the local site, and enables me to have a project that tours and can engage with audiences in a different way. Formally it's the same, but conceptually it changes from site to site. But the origins were in Franklin Square in Tasmania, if anyone knows that site. I was asked to do a project in this park, and I did a lot of research on Franklin, who was first governor of Tasmania, lived in Hobart. And what I found out was his wife was really active in many ways, a lot more active than he was. And I started to think about monuments and how women are represented in these monuments. So this history was really interesting to me. So what we did, we made a 3D animation of Lady Jane Franklin projected into the base of the portrait. And she just very slowly moves around as she supports her husband in his endeavours, and this idea of who is honoured in public space and that story. Here we have a young girl. This story is this became the catalyst to tell another story about this space. This is what became exciting to me and showed me that, you know, this ability to extend beyond the monument and use the monument as a catalyst to tell other stories through temporal public art. And so this is a story around Mathino, who was a young Indigenous girl taken in by this family with all good intentions. So I represented her here, and Lady Jane Franklin in the background of the sculpture of. And then as a catalyst to tell the story, because it's a story in which these two left her to fend for herself, and it's not a pleasant story, but what it did was the work itself provided the catalyst to understand that story or tell that story. The sort of story you would never be able to tell with a monument, right? It's too specific. You know, the requirements of a monument are that it needs to be relevant over such a broad period of time. And so that's my interest in this. This is where I started to think, well, you know, this can be an alternative, not an alternative, actually just an addition to the type of ways that we might utilise civic spaces and talk about the stories of the people who've contributed to the places we live in. This is moving image, so she glances at the statue every now and then. So to go further, this is the Botanical Gardens in Brisbane. And this is a really lovely project because John had started working in these botanical gardens when he left school when he was 15, and he was just about to retire. So when I was doing the research on this site, I happened across him and had a conversation with him, and then I pushed for him to be the subject of the monuments for this project. In this idea, this is a person who has looked after this space and made it accessible. And this is where monuments as a concept broadened into this idea of let's start recognising all sorts of contributions to the places we live in. And so that was, you know, that was another way of broadening the whole concept for the monuments project. So since 2018, I was invited to Colorado to do a project. The host of that project up in Breckenridge, it was very successful and suggested that I find a agent and an agent that they worked with. So we end up packaging the whole project as monuments, and that's being sort of, I guess, what agents do, sold to different places around the US. So I've been lucky enough to do sort of 3 projects a year, roughly, since that time. And even during the pandemic, we did a couple remotely. And the first one at Strathmore was done remotely, which is complicated, but you know, we ended up making it work. These are just 3 recent ones that have taken place. This one's still on right now. I've just come from Ann Arbor, and this one was presented, and then Strathmore's just up, and that was one of Art Park's. And what's interesting about monuments is I've been able to bring in a whole lot of community engagement ideas and projects that I've worked on over the years. And what I wanted to do was to have a more collaborative base to the development of these works, as opposed to an artist just coming in and sort of presenting or installing my work. This project requires the host to think about who should be represented in these public spaces. And that's I think it's a legacy of the project, is that's instilled in the community. And they have to think about who are the people that should be represented as the monuments for this project. And everyone has a different approach. I stay out of it to a degree. You know, I set up the concept that this shouldn't be someone who we'd normally see immortalised in a monument. It should be people who are making different types of contributions. But, you know, for Art Park is having its 50th year. So there was everyone from roadies that had been there for, you know, nearly all that time, to people in administration and First Nation people as well who are running programs on site. Ann Arbor is also 200 years anniversary of Ann Arbor itself. So, and these are environmentalists and work in social justice across the town. And then monuments over in Rochester Fringe last year. And these are the sort of things that happened. The lady on the right-hand side there at the Rochester Fringe, she'd been a teacher aide for many, many years at this school that was in the downtown. And they went through a public nomination system where they put it in the paper and said, you know, who should be honoured. So it was quite a complex way of doing it, but she was represented. And on the night, you know, there was 3 busloads of kids from the school turn up to see her. And it's this sort of recognition of the efforts they've made to people who don't normally, you know, don't often have this opportunity, and especially for their family, etc. So it's, once again, this legacy idea is what I'm trying to explore beyond the actual experience of the artwork, is how does it create something that lasts longer? And I've even seen the way that the people participating in this start connecting, you know, because they do have common goals, right, you know, in the community. This is a still from, so based on these works, Neil Young contacted me and said, I want to do a film clip with this work. It didn't, I don't know if you've seen the Love Earth film clip, but it's on his most recent album. It was complex. Typically these things that need to be done in 2 weeks. But I sent instructions for the filming of Neil here, and it was sent to us to do the post-production, and we had a film crew go out into the bush, actually at Woodford Folk Festival, where the origins of it, and we used drones, etc., to film Neil in different parts of the environment, and then they took that footage and edited it back into that film clip. Here's so there's a few examples of other applications as opposed to the trees. So this is a pretty powerful work. Once again, I toured Australia for almost 2 years with the Museum of Contemporary Art in Sydney, and we built a custom motorhome with projectors and generators. And I spent 2 years going into small communities and just developing new works. I showed some existing works, but I made basically new works with these communities. This is in a place called Derby, up in the far north of Western Australia. And the boab trees are really dominant in this part of Australia, and they are culturally really significant for First Nation people for a whole lot of reasons, actually even practical reasons, water, shelter, etc. What had happened in Derby at this time, I was talking to Auntie Lena, and she was concerned because the perception of these trees had changed recently, and maybe just for a time, I'm not really aware, but young people had started taking their own life in these trees as a statement. And we decided that it would be great if she could reclaim the cultural history and the history of the tree through her stories of place, to shift that perception of these trees. You know, it was quite a sad story. It was a bad condition, but this enabled to communicate some of the origins of the trees and move away from that. You know, so not overtly political, but just sort of freshening things up and saying, look, you know, there is other ways to think about this place. So yeah, they're the sort of things that can evolve from a sort of a conversation, really, and that's the way I like to start projects that are really specific. Another really complicated project, because here we are in the Pilbara. Obviously, everyone knows or most people would know, this is where iron ore, and this is the Bar Peninsula where iron ore is shipped out of. It's also a place where you've got fertiliser factories and you've got a whole lot of large commercial entities. But of course, these rocks here, and it's not a very big peninsula, there's over 1 million documented hieroglyphs in this one peninsula. So people have been carving into stone for over 40,000 years. And they're just the documented ones. I seriously would have lunch one day and look down and there'd be a drawing on a rock, because obviously people gathered in the shady spots, right? And would spend time drawing on the rocks. But this project was actually funded. One of the agreements for Rio Tinto to go into this area is that they had to spend a certain amount of money to recognise the importance of the rock art in this region. It was part of the deal. And previously they'd done a publication to document it, but this was going to be a new approach, new way of doing that. So I went into the Pilbara and started to talk to the Murrujuga Aboriginal Corporation, which is made up of 4 language groups. And we started looking at the landscape, and I got a greater awareness of the importance of this landscape and its unsettled landscape and its origins. And then we decided to focus on 5 specific elders who had different positions within the community, whether it be women's business, law, etc. There was all these. And then talk about the places that their stories or their commitment to the culture and the country come from. So we'd go to those spots. So I filmed these elders. We did audio as well, so they told cultural story about the places we were going to project them. And so we made these series of works, and then we projected it into the landscape on the sites that the stories were coming from and where they were culturally linked. Interesting for me, someone who's really quite interested in just the ephemeral and not permanent works, the idea of experience as opposed to object and the commodification of art. But for this, no one would come out and see this, right? These sites are full of spirits. It's okay for me to go there, but no one else is going to go there, right, from the community. So, and what was going to be useful is we turned these into large-scale photographic prints and a series of video works. And they actually all went back to the MCA for a big exhibition at the MCA, where I had 40 containers of iron ore in the gallery and had these images sort of surrounding it as this sort of conversation about the meaning of landscape, the commodification of landscape, and that confliction. And the elders came to that opening, and it was a sad day, right? To see landscape in that form was sad. But they are experiencing that every day there. So the work was about that. So it wasn't directly showing rock art. It was more going deeper into the cultural significance. And as they explained to me, the only way they could explain or try and determine how I would understand the significance of this was calling it their Bible. So, as the landscape, as their Bible. So moving away from that, this is another application. So during that tour of Australia with the MCA, my wife's an artist also, and she travelled with me, Hiromi Tango, and she's Japanese born. We started a project called Home, where I just interview people about their ideas of home, and then Hiromi would work with the community and they asked them to bring in objects and materials that relate to their idea of home, and they'd build these big sculptures and big collaged walls. I would then video project these interviews over these big sculptures and collaged walls. So all the objects and materials relate to the people's idea and notion of home. And then sometimes they're letters, they're photographs, they're roller skates, there could be anything. But this sort of dialogue, it's similar to the trees in a way, by projecting these portraits over these objects and materials, you set up this sort of narrative between the image and the moving image and the actual object. And I'm just moving through sort of different applications for projection as well. So there was a festival in Melbourne called White Night, which is actually based on Nuit Blanche, which started in Paris but is quite big in Toronto, and I've made works in Toronto with that. But they were in Melbourne, and this is the Melbourne Baths, a beautiful old historical bath. Once again, researching the site and Indigenous history, the eel is a really prominent animal in a lot of cultural story around this site. So we created these as projections filling mapped to the whole baths, and we created an algorithmic work. So as the eel moves through the space, it disperses those eggs on a random basis. So it's not determined, it's actually just randomly running off an algorithm. Pretty extravagant White Night. It's one night, right? 24 hours or 12 hours, and same with Toronto. But yeah, this is a work called The Residence. Many years ago, I created a permanent work in the Ipswich River, which is just west of Brisbane, and it was called Classification Pending. And what I did is I made a 3D hybrid of mythological organisms and actual organisms that live in that river and the stories that come from that river. And it was a fully 3D animated organism that we projected into the water. And it's quite a convincing illusion as it rises and disappears. For that work, it was sort of the origins of thinking about public art and how it could, as a permanent work, how it could evolve. So for 4 months of the year, there's a single organism swims around in the river after dark. The next 4 would be joined by a female, and then they'd have offspring for the last 4. So it's this sort of natural narrative around life cycles that I was able to build. Now that's a really primitive way of doing it, having these 4 slots. We've actually developed ways now where we use sensors in the water so the organism can end up being a reflection of the condition of the river, you know, so evolutionary traits can start determined through what we can collect as data in the river itself. But this work was for the World Science Festival, and we created a very accurate plesiosaur, which were known to swim in this region of Brisbane, you know, however long that was. So it's 10 metres in length, and if you're walking across the Goodwill Bridge in Brisbane, you could look down and you would see these 10 metres, and there was a female which is smaller, and a juvenile as well, which would appear, and also schools of fish would circle around as well. As part of that, we created these, this is actually the projection tower which we're projecting the river, what appears to be 4 live feed monitors. So we created video of the creatures underwater, under the bridge. There's old car bodies and so on. And then we overlaid real-time time code on these monitors and set it up as if it's, and aesthetically we made the content look like live feed. So you get this sense that you're seeing a live footage of them being quite dormant during the day under the bridge before they're active at night. So it sets up this sort of, and look, I've used that technique on a whole range of projects before, and it's constantly surprises me once you use that aesthetic how believable it is. And people really, you know, it's a plesiosaur, like really, yes. But the kids are just going crazy on this whole idea that, and I'll just show you a bit of video. This is a bit long, but I'll just see if I can scroll through it a bit.
Oh, I see him! I see him! Oh!
There he is. There he is.
I actually saw an actual shot. No! No, I actually saw an actual shot. No!
What do you see up here? Kids, look.
Oh, no, but I actually saw.
See one here?
No, that is and we threw it. Wait. Fish. There's more. Look at that.
Did you see them yet?
Yes. Look at that.
It's a dinosaur that used to live in Australia.
Oh my god.
It's reappeared now.
I can see someone. Sanya, come on.
This is a really lovely project. And if anyone's got any questions as I'm talking to, please feel free to, because I'm covering a lot of ground. But this is in Lismore, and this is the local library in Lismore. Lismore's a fairly small town in Northern Rivers. a flood town, as you probably, most people would know. And I actually grew up in Lismore. But anyway, this is a project with the Lismore Regional Gallery. And Auntie Irene Harrington is a really significant individual and an elder for this region. But what was interesting, she went to school here, right? This used to be the school grounds. And she also lived in the mission off-site. And she lived through a time where you couldn't speak language in schools. It was illegal. So given this was a library, and this is where they wanted me to make the work, her story became really significant, right? Because she told stories around, in the mission, she would learn to draw and understand her language with sticks in the dirt, and then at school she'd be pushed off to the library. So she had this dual life of interpreting and learning. So that became a really, I thought, really significant way to sort of approach this project. So the building breaks, there's a lot of components to this, but she's occupying that space. She tells story around that. But in front of this is what appears to be a spotlight on the ground in front of the narrative that plays out at the back about her relationship to both the library and her stories around navigating that space between the two cultures, even between her parents and the teachers, right? You know, you've just got this conflict that she had to live with. And she talks about how culture was left under the rug. So we projected this big sort of quite colonial rug in front, on the ground plane in front of this work. And it was made of sand, so the kids could sort of play with it. But eventually we used what was really, you know, look, listen, learn is something that's a mantra for her. So we had that projected in English, and then it's handwritten in the sand in the foreground. So it's sort of, you know, setting up that relationship between the two. And then her nephew is an artist. So we worked with him and we animated his paintings so that they would eventually take over that space from the rug to the writing to artwork. And that eventually takes over the whole building. Coolangatta Surf Club. This is near where I live. This is my home. Yeah, you know it. Yeah. This is really a prototype, but there's a festival in where I live. I live right near Snapper Rocks and Kira, which are some of the most significant surf spots in Australia. And one of the things around that is that the conversation is pretty well focused on the weather and the wind conditions and the swell direction and swell height. So I've been thinking about a new work for a while, and what I decided to do is sort of try and build an installation based on real-time data I could collect off the ocean buoys that were just off the coast at Tweed Heads. It's the same data that the big pumping jetty uses on the south side of the Tweed River, which determines how much sand is pumped across the river to give all the surf beaches sand. It's all a very artificial way of, but you know, we built a rock wall at the mouth of the river, so we have to get the sand across. What I created was this room that feels like a room full of sand, and if you see up the top corner there, it's got references to the data that's coming in, whether it's wind speed, wind direction, wave height. So all that data comes in and it actually influences the sand in the room. The sand moves in response to the data that's coming in. And my as a long-term objective here is to sort of maybe make a permanent work as the new sort of town clock for Coolangatta, you know, because what I'm interested in is that it takes time to learn the language. Like this work is developing a new language, but it'll be a language you'll only know if you're part of that community, and you see it over time and you see the relationship between what's happening in the natural environment and what's going on in the work. And I think that's a really productive thing to do, to instill that sort of knowledge with the local community. And of course they'll share that, right? But also it's just, it could be quite practical as well. You know, if you're driving fast, you wonder what the surf conditions are. Once you know the language, it fulfills that sort of function. So there's just a little video that was made by the festival that just gives you an idea of how it And I'm trying to incorporate this idea of data feeding into that content and seeing how that would change based on the conditions of the specific site. Woodford over Christmas is incredibly dynamic weather-wise, quite often too dynamic. It goes from extreme heats to thunderstorms to... but the idea that we can take that sort of data and have that influence the outcome of the work itself in reference to... I mean, what I want to try and do is make more work that's not, so obviously from environmental sources like data sources, but somehow link it to individuals in the space as well. So, there's a bit, I'm still working on that obviously, but yeah, and I mean, my experience with these permanence works, like the first one I did in Ipswich with the creature, that engaged whole programs from the school. They were going down there and teaching evolution and so on at the schools. They ran the local newspaper, ended up doing a competition to name them. There's this sort of idea that, I love that idea where you hand it over and then it becomes the community's response. And it's a bit what's happening in Strathmore here. Like I haven't worked with a commissioner of the monuments work like Strathmore who have embraced it in a way and extended into all sorts of education and audio opportunities. And I mean, they're running a program every Monday night with the participants to tell their story. Inviting the public and having live music. I mean, it's really quite substantial how they've built from the project. And that's that legacy stuff that I really hope and try, and feel like it's the purpose of what I do is to sort of try and make it, one, yes, the experience with the work is important, but what does it do prior or after that as well? It's a great challenge, I think, as an artist. So this is a real preview. This is a work that has been nearly 7 years in the making, unbelievably. It's commissioned by the Parramatta City Council. If you know Sydney, Parramatta's west of Sydney, but is almost as big, and it's evolved really dramatically over time. I was asked to do a commission. I received a commission nearly 8 years ago. A lot of things changed in that time, but I did focus on this. There was a rock escarpment at the ferry terminal, the water ferry terminal, and there was this sort of beacon really of this piece of nature that had survived the vast urbanisation that had encompassed the whole space, and I sort of identified that as a location that I'd like to use. Fortunately, we got to the point where I could use it. There was a lot of consultation with the Dura community there. It was a highly, protocols and consultation were a big, which is usually a big part of my practice anyway on any project I do. But given this is a permanent work and all the issues that arise through making something permanent, this was much more complicated than usual. And also it's a video work, right? So commissioners usually get a maquette or something of a sculpture and it's pretty clear what you're going to get. It's pretty hard to make the video what it's going to look like before you make it, right? And then to see what it looks like when you've got it projected on a rock escarpment. Anyway, we worked out ways to do that, but it did take a long time. But it's a work that is 30 minutes in duration as a total work. And what it really, it creates a sort of transformation of that landscape and the sort of conditions that have altered that landscape over a vast period of time, whether that be through nature or man-made. And so it's a very interventionist work on this escarpment which evolves over that half-hour period in a very slow way. And that's on purpose because it is a permanent work. I hope that the public sort of just see moments of it at any given time. It's not something you're going to sit down and watch like a movie. It sort of slowly evolves. So I'll just this is a condensed version. It's only a minute and a bit of taking snippets really from the whole sequence. So you can see it occupies from under the stairwell right through here. So we've even fabricated these trees. Use of language, sort of, the importance of the stars, how that's interpreted through to the emu. All these things were brought up as far as consultation and origins of landscape. What you'll see is these eels that appear to come in and out of these crevices. So the eels are really important for the Dura community in this area. And in our consultation, we discussed this idea that, even though the landscape will change, and will evolve, the eel should always be present, you know, this idea, and it's sort of representational of the strength of the culture to exist. The animal is referencing that. So there's all sorts of stages that happen with, you know, so the water has washed away the external dirt, then we expose these sedimentary layers. There's midden layers in there, there's fossil, and then of course it builds up again. And then we start seeing this sort of, you know, the compartments being built into the landscape. It sort of switches to an aerial view, so you start seeing it being divided, you know, through trails, etc. And I start introducing, it starts off with First Nation language, and then as it goes on, you'll start seeing languages from all the different cultures that are represented in Parramatta. So it sort of starts making this sort of blend of what it is now, what Parramatta is now. And then it moves through these stages of, obviously, the urbanisation of the landscape. And for me, it was sort of ability to make a work of the great responsibility we put on landscape, really, and its durability. So look, that's a sort of overview of projects that I'm doing, some recent ones and sort of, you know, others that have influenced monuments as a project. So yeah, I'm happy to take some questions if there's any questions about any of the projects.
The Strathmore one opens tonight, I was noticing. Could you explain what the idea was behind that one? It says it runs for a month.
Yeah, so they're focused really on, as far as selection. So the process is pretty clear. So I instill this idea that monuments should be around people who make contributions to a place. Now, that can be interpreted in many ways. For this year's Strathmore, it's environmentalists and, you know, people doing it covers social goods across that region. So they ran quite an extensive selection process with a committee and consultation with different people, and they've selected 4 people to be represented for that work. So they're the individuals, and you can see it all on their web. Their website has all the details of their individuals. There's an audio trail you can download when you get there, so you can actually stand in front of the trees and hear about that person. That plays out in different ways in different projects. Quite often on the projection tower, which is where we're projecting from, we will have the bios and the information about each of the individuals that are represented. So, you know, the installation is sort of catalyst to learn more about those people. Yeah, so but Strathmore, there's a lot of information that you can access on their website and then linked into their audio files as well.
On the invite that you received there, that takes you to the webpage for this event, there is a link there to Strathmore's page for this event, so you can access it that way.
Yeah.
It's 8 to 10 at night.
That's right, yeah. Sorry.
I wondered, as an artist, how do you feel about like Sydney's Vivid and the way that Sydney's been using iconic buildings like the Opera House and so forth for kind of light experiences?
I'm not sure what I should say. I mean, obviously, you know, I was around in the early days, and I probably did the first big moving image piece in Sydney for the Sydney Festival back in 2002 or 2002 or something. But I've sort of stayed away from it, to be honest. I don't know, there's a funny stage with any medium that has this appeal is that it does become commercialised. And I saw a process where a lot of work is being generated from the companies and not necessarily from the artists. You know, I think it's been really, really good for Sydney to have that there. I think it's probably running a little bit thin now. I think they've had to execute their program on a wider basis to include other things because it just doesn't. It's become a bit like fireworks. You know, it's sort of a very instant experience, but maybe not something that lingers. So I've just chosen to my own path. You know, my work is I try to make it sort of quite conceptual and really strongly linked to a place. And not that they don't support that sort of work, but it requires a different type of commitment. And I guess I grew up, you know, when I started my practice, there wasn't any commercial world. You know, I mean, when we first started doing mapping artwork, there was no software or anything to do that. We had to. I remember projecting a grid up on this building and then having a grid in paper. It's a bit like how Da Vinci used to work out his, and I had to draw you know, within that grid where I wanted the image. That's how we did mapping. And then you take that away and you have to render it all and then bring it back. And oh, we're just out a little bit. We have to redo it, you know. So it's a different, I don't know, I feel there's an authenticity for the reason that I do it, because I think I really did see the potential, and I do see the potential for new forms of sculpture and new forms of installation. That's what excited me. It was that pursuit. And I don't know if that work is really about that. I think it's just become a big business. So, you know, that's what happens, right, when it's a big business. But I've just keep doing my own thing on the side, and you know, I get enough commissions, and people sort of aware. I think there's a certain authenticity with my work that people appreciate, and I know from Strathmore, this project specifically, not many commissioners get the opportunity to collaborate with the artist. So this whole project is very collaborative, and I know that they really enjoy that. You know, it's a really great opportunity, and it benefits the project from my perspective, because obviously I'm coming from elsewhere. I don't know anything about that place, but it also gives that buy-in and that input from that community and the host itself. And I think the work Monuments now is sort of a culmination of a lot of these things that I've explored. You know, I really feel like I spent 20 years exploring and experimenting, and I think Monuments is an example of looking at all those years and bring it into a piece that sort of does do a lot, you know, and I'm able to share it. And I have been able to share it for 25 years. I mean, and the effect never changes on the audience. It's been the same for that period of time, so.
I can't help but think about how you were talking about your work as most of it being temporary, but also, you know, it's very data-driven, and how your temporary work, it really is historical records. You're creating historical records of people, place, history, evolving, and things like that. So I don't know if you have any kind of thoughts around that, and yeah, just the kind of the juxtaposition of temporary works creating this historical.
Yeah, it's conflicting at times, right? You know, I've had 2 monographs done, which were really satisfying. They were a lot of work, but to have it in a document, like that is actually an object that the work has been condensed into. So that was it's quite relieving, actually, because, you know, so much of my work just exists in documentation. You know, it doesn't exist unless you're there or you see it like this. So, which, you know, I'm committed to, because I do think that creates a type of work that's is experiential for the audience far more than if I was thinking about that. But it is, of course, documented. So it does build a history, and it does document that history. I think it's really interesting with something like Strathmore, and it's happened in other locations, where you start thinking about, well, how would I build a collection, you know, as a permanent work or so on, where you could actually, and I've had these discussions with quite a few people, and some in the States, about the potential of doing this, but it becomes a permanent work, and then, so you spend the money on the projectors and the housing and make it, which is very possible now. And then you look at how you might build a collection of portraits that might play out at different times in different ways, you know, based on different situations or events that might take place, without being a promotion, right? But just this idea that you might have a collection that you can curate from, I think has a lot of potential, you know, yeah.
Kind of off the back of that too is this idea, and you refer to it as legacy, but I've seen it a lot with contemporary artists, is this recognizing this need to what's the right way to say it? Bring institutions and communities back around to acknowledging and holding them accountable for what they should be doing. And I feel like the legacy of your work is doing that. These community centers and, you know, art institutions and just communities in general. And I'm just wondering if that's kind of how you see the intentionality of your work.
Well, it's sort of interesting when I think about the history. The first exhibition I did, which was at the Institute of Modern Art in Brisbane, so I'd graduated and they asked me to do an exhibition. And what I did is I just pulled all the windows out of the gallery and put chairs in front of the windows. So I was asking people to look outside for the art. Now you would think that would kill my, but in fact it just inflamed the interest in my work. You know, as the art world does, right? They'd rather incorporate you than have you working against them. So that actually led to a whole lot of works that I did about sort of creating spaces, external, even the conflict between the external and the internal. And I did a whole lot of projects like that, creating cavities in the gallery, you know, to experience the external. But I do think that it's exciting for institutions. And I think, you know, somewhere like Strathmore is, especially when it's focused on performance, more so than, say, the visual arts, it's a really exciting project and a really different project to take on. Probably contemporary art institutions are more used to doing that sort of thing. But even in saying that, you know, there's still, what I've found over time is that as the major institutions, like I was lucky enough to come through as a young artist in a time where ephemeral works were supported by the institutions, and this idea not everything had to be connected to the collection and not everything had to be of value added. And you know, I was getting commissioned by nearly every state gallery in Australia commissioned ephemeral works for me to do. I saw that change where as it became corporatised and the collection became so important, they were only really interested in if it was an extension of something that existed in their collection. So I think that's still happening. I think we see that a lot as the public outcomes, but we don't see, I think it's harder for an artist to do what I'm doing now. And so, but I do think what I am doing now is something fresh for a lot of institutions to take on. So it's sort of working in my favour, but yeah, it's a complex. And art always changes, you know, there'll always be different objectives. Hi.
That's really interesting, that story about the first work that you did where you took the windows out. Because I was going to ask about the relationship to technology and advances in technology and sort of how your practice maybe had shifted, or if there was some, whether it's in hardware and projectors or animation techniques or accessibility. But now I wonder if you think of your work as having this relationship to technology, or is it all sort of conceptually driven, and then whatever the technology is at the time is what you use to execute the idea?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a tool. And in fact, it's a tool I don't even like that much, to be honest. It's quite, and especially the early days, it was so painful to use. I mean, we used to spend all night. You could only render for 5 minutes or something, and you'd have to wake up and push the button again for another render, and then you have to stitch it together. It would take days to make 10 minutes of footage. But it's that, yeah, exactly. So it's a conceptual objective, you know, which I haven't been able to move past what that technology can give me as far as exploring new forms of installation and sculpture. But in saying that, it's in building an awareness of what technology can give me and having people with me who work with me who are very aware of that technology. As someone who's directing the projects, I have this great flexibility with concepts. I mean, it's a while since I've done a big sculpture work, but the Sediuchi Triennale in 22, we did a big project. And on visiting that site, I saw these fishing boats that were existing in the harbour on those islands in the inland sea of Japan. Young people have left, fishing's in decline, no one can afford to get rid of the boats, so they're just sitting there in decay. So my idea, and it was fantastic, they took it on, they loved it, was to take that boat out and completely mirror it. So mirror perspex the whole boat. And that came from the concept of where does this object exist now in the space? Is it reflects on a history, but it's also disappearing. So mirror became a really conceptually the right material to address that. And then they put it back in, they completely mirrored it with mirrored perspex, the whole thing, and then dropped it back in the harbour where it was. And it sat there for 6 months as part of the Sediuchi Triennale. So yes, it's driven by concepts. Yeah, I think as any artist would attest, when obviously I've done so much work with projections, so obviously I get commissioned to do a lot of that type of work, and yeah, so. But yeah, given the opportunity, I'm always open. I try to keep it open. Mediums should be open. They're just tools in trying to develop the concept.
I've got two questions on the tools. Obviously, for the first one, using the building or the structure quite a lot, but for those more flatter surfaces like the ground in front or the transparent surfaces like the river and that, are you using interferometry for that, or are you just doing planar sort of projections and relying on
Yeah, they're just projection, 3D animated projection. And when we did the first one, I was lucky enough, my warehouse studio was right by a river. And we just kept playing with because it was quite, the thing with projection, and you've probably experienced if you've seen much, it either works or it doesn't, and when it doesn't, it can look really terrible. And it was a long time of trying to make this work, but we just end up making subtle changes to the contrast, the texture, where it existed in the water itself, where we were trying to make it exist. So yeah, no, we use, for other projects I've done recently, where, for instance, where we've got 3 projectors which are doing a tree and then a mountain and then a pond, that will be all laser mapped. So that's a real possibility. It makes our job much easier now, so they can do a laser map of that whole 3D map of that whole area. Then when we want to put our content, we just build it into that laser map. So there's technology that's made that easier. The projectors are obviously brighter, so you know we used to always, every event I struggle with people to turn lights off. You know, now it's getting to a stage where that's not such an issue. So yeah, the technology of the projector is pretty basic, right? Like it does what it does. How we're exploring, you know, the software that generates the work and so on is opening up, because especially real-time data-driven work, you know, is pretty heavy to process. And
My other part was around, do you take in oral sensors, like things like, speaking of Woodford, the picnic hanging rocks, watching that on the anniversary screening, the cockatoos or magpies at sunset, or dawn service is often one of those things, you take in a lot of the bird life and environment of that sunset, sunrise activity. Do you take in some of those as triggers for some of your...
yeah, well, quite often they exist, right, in the places we're in, you know. But audio plays out when it's the right time. I mean, one of the most successful ones I think I did was in Hyde Park in Sydney. And what I did is I found 3 individuals who had a long history of protest in that park. And I asked them what their favourite protest song was. And then we put together a choir of whistlers to whistle those songs. And it played as an audio track, as an ambient track throughout the tree projections. And I thought that was really successful because it was wind, you know, it linked into the environment as opposed to words or English or any other type of spoken word. But yeah, it does play a part. Like there was a work at Woodford where there was recordings done. It was about mycelium. We did the whole project around underground communication with Lindsay Pollock, who's a quite experimental musician. And he took recordings of growth and under the trees and so on and built that as part of the soundtrack. So yeah, it does play a part, yeah. But quite often, you know, for something like that permanent work in Parramatta, that's a really complex thing to create sound audio for. You know, something that exists there every night and people are going to go jogging past it every night. It's,
I was thinking more of the inverse, does it trigger the, you know, used it, microphones say to trigger images?
I've done some theatre works where we've done that, you know, but not necessarily in the natural environment, no. But yeah, we're looking at this new version of the tree projection, which will be sort of influenced by data, but we're also looking at how we map all the area around it, and we can map audience movement, which may correspond to the actions of the tree as well. So,
And that's what the Strathmore one actually does.
Oh no, that's an audio tour.
Yep.
Yeah.
But as we move closer.
Yeah, it's geolocated. So when you move within the vicinity of the tree, that's when you can access that audio. But it's also, that audio is on the website, so you can sort of see the tree and go and hit the website and have a listen to it too.
Thank you so much.
All right, pleasure.